A few years ago, I interviewed the Reverend John Stott. Some of you may have seen those interviews, quite a while back actually. But very, very well-known author, and of course, long-established pastor of the marvelous church in Langham, London, England, All Souls. Had a big influence in London, big influence on Her Majesty the Queen. And I didn't know that years later I'd have a chance to talk to someone who kind of sat under Stott and was mentored by him and became for many years the curate, which means the assistant pastor, associate pastor, second in command of All Souls in Langham. His name is Mark Meynell. He's written a book called A Wilderness of Mirrors, Trusting Again in a Cynical World. This is fascinating, Mark. Why did you decide to write a book on the cynicism of our culture?
That's a great question. I think it's because it's all around us, and I was confronting it living in central London day by day. But the specific catalyst was I was talking to a good friend who has a good mind and engages with the world, and he was trying to persuade me that the moon landings didn't happen. Right. And in every other respect, he sort of engaged with the world at a fairly rational, sensible level, but was really dead serious about this. And I was thinking, but that's insane, that's ridiculous, of course they happened. But that led me down a very windy path, thinking about why people believe different conspiracy theories, what is it about our world that gets really people so sort of even paranoid about what's going on, in one word, cynical about it. And so I wanted to really engage with that.
And the thing about cynicism, of course, is it is built on a profound lack of trust.
Profound, yeah.
Profound lack of trust. Now, you mentioned in your book that there were three guys who really contributed to the profound lack of trust in our culture. You call them, I think, masters of suspicion.
Okay.
Darwin, Marx, and Freud.
Correct.
Just quickly, how did those three guys contribute to the profound lack of trust in our culture?
Well, in their different ways, they unpicked the sort of belief systems that people held for many centuries, and they made it plausible to believe in a world that could exist without God. So Darwin gave us explanations for this world. Freud could explain something of human nature without the need for a soul or being in the image of God.
And also sexuality was a critical factor in his writings, right?
Precisely.
And what about Marx?
That he could take God out of the sense of history, that there could be progress, there could be a dynamic to society.
So when Nietzsche declared that God was dead,
Mm-hmm.
he was consistent with these guys. Now, I think this is called post-Enlightenment thinking, right?
Correct.
Does it surprise you then, in this post-Enlightenment era, that people are cynical? I mean, I'm wondering, is Edward Snowden the new high priest of cynicism?
Yeah, well, he's a very divisive figure, but in some ways he represents two sides of the same coin. So those who are utterly opposed to what he has done see that he has sort of undermined trust, and those who follow him think that he's the sort of the flag waver for exposing skullduggery in high places.
Now, how does fundamentalism fit into this? Now, the fundamentalists, Christian, Jewish, Islamic, are given a bad rap these days, and I think in many cases rightly so. But the one thing a committed fundamentalist will say is that you got to have some moral absolutes in our world. Without the absolutes, we're adrift. Is the fundamentalist viewpoint right?
Well, it's one thing to say that there are moral absolutes. It's another thing to say, I know what they are and I have the power to be able to impose them.
Right, right.
And that's the problem.
Yeah, but is it possible to find a moral absolute or two?
One or two, perhaps. I think certainly, yes.
Could you name one or two?
Well, there is a God who is holy and just, and that he calls on his people to be holy as he is. But the question then lies, and I think this is where the suspicion comes in again, because of Nietzsche and other people, is what lies behind somebody who insists on this set of moral values to be imposed on other people. And so this suspicion corrodes, it digs away at all the things that people say, and you say, well, you're saying that not because it's true, but because you want to get one up on me. And so it undermines people's presentation. It may be right what they're saying, But what the suspicion does will undermine profoundly the person making that claim.
Now, you make the point in the book that our contemporary culture, without any kind of sense of moral absolutes, pretty much has opted for interpretive values.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what is right for me is not necessarily right for you,
Correct.
and I will respect that you and I disagree because you have a right to disagree, and yada, yada, yada. Mm. And you talk about the vertigo of interpretation.
Correct.
Which means we're all falling.
Yeah.
I mean, what about this hermeneutic, this interpretive view of the world? Are we onto something there, or is this leading us astray?
What's very difficult to deal with is that you can see where this starts. You've got to say, well, my understanding of anything is to some extent limited. I can't know everything, you can't know everything. That means that my perspective is constrained to some extent. So when I make a statement, I've always got to add a degree of provisionality. The problem comes, though, is that, as you say, it leads to this vertigo of interpretation, because basically everything gets unpicked, everything gets corroded, and you don't know where it stops.
Now, you've got two teenagers, boy and a girl. I'm sure you have some father-child conversations around the dinner table. How are you introducing a sense of meaning and purpose to life when they are growing up in a culture that says the only meaning and purpose is what your preference is?
Yes. Well, I think the key thing, the source of this culture of suspicion is the abuse of power. And so one of the key things that I want to say in the book, and I think we need to call churches across the board back to, is the model of power that is presented by Christ. Because he uniquely in human history has showed us what power that is authentic and generous and grace-filled can do.
Is this power as service?
Correct.
Yeah.
So one of the fascinating things about Jesus is that he has absolute power. He is granted power over all things, the power to judge. And you know, at one level, you think that is the dictator's dream. That's what Stalin and Hitler dreamt of, you know, the 1,000-year Reich or whatever it is. But Jesus has power to the nth degree of that. And then you say, well, what does he do with that? Well, he forgives, he casts out demons, he heals, he dies on a cross. Yeah. Now that radically subverts everything that is going on in our culture. And that is the one thing, ironically, that challenges Nietzsche and all those masters of suspicion. Because they will say every time someone makes a claim, it is a power claim. And Jesus will say, well, yes, it is, but look what I do with that power. I die for you.
This is why Gandhi loved them.
Certainly. So I think one of the things, and you know, I've talked a bit about this with my children, although they tend to sort of roll their eyes a little bit when I talk about important things. But we need to call the church to be as concerned about power as we're concerned about truth. We don't stop talking about truth, but we need to see how power operates.
Are you telling me that God is not a Republican?
Well, I'm a Brit, so I'm going to stay clear of that statement.
We'll move right along. Okay. When I read a guy's book, I try to find a sentence or two that, for me, captures, in some ways, the between-the-lines essence of what he's saying. And sometimes I'm right, sometimes I'm wrong. Here's what I chose for you, okay? It's on page 129.
I can't remember it.
And you can tell me if I'm right or wrong. Theologians can use their learning to find valid reasons for justifying any course of action, concealing private agendas behind appeals to a revelation of divine authority. Personal preference trumps divine authority. To me, you're making a confession here when you wrote those sentences. My question is this. As a church leader, as a preacher, as someone who influences not only his own children's lives, but the lives of thousands of other people through his writing and preaching, how much do you trust your interpretive view of Jesus and the Gospels?
That's a brilliant question, because I think it calls for humility, openness to others, and a sort of degree of self-knowledge and circumspection, so that we are always ready to learn. I mean, you mentioned John Stott at the beginning. I think one of the things I loved about Uncle John, and I saw this because I knew him a little bit towards the end of his life, but he was always learning. He was always ready to take on a new idea and weigh it. It didn't necessarily mean he bought it, but he would consider it. And so we have constantly to be disciples. That's what the New Testament says we are, and a disciple is literally a learner. And so, we want to preach with conviction. We want to preach with confidence because we're talking about God's work in his world, while at the same time being willing to learn, to understand, and to keep going back to the scriptures.
Okay, so it's a cynical world. There's a distinct lack of trust. We've got 3 minutes to go. Why do you trust God? And why do you put such stock in Jesus and the Gospels?
I think one of the reasons personally that I have been drawn and tempted to deep cynicism is because of the experience of power being abused. But I also look at 20th century history. It's one of the things that fascinates me. You know, we are living with the legacy of the last century, which was the most bloody, the most brutal and horrifying century in human history. And, many people come out of that in utter despair. And they've seen what human power at its worst can do. For me, I keep coming back to the character of God and what he does with that absolute divine, almighty power. So actually, I don't think I could be a believer in God, let alone a Christian, were it not for Jesus' incarnation of God, and you see him in action, culminating at the cross. That is the key thing for me, because we see a God who subverts human power and wisdom. So it's the 1 Corinthians 1 and 2 stuff. The power of God, the wisdom of God. In worldly terms, in Nietzsche terms, it's insanity, it's pathetic.
When you're going through the dark night of the soul, and you have done so because of depression, a lot of that relates to post-traumatic stress disorder coming out of Uganda. That's another interview. How do you relate to the God who loves you when you feel your prayers are bouncing off the ceiling?
Well, for me, the Psalms have been crucial because God has given us in the Psalms a vocabulary and a hymn book for despair even. You take a psalm like Psalm 88. I mean, how did that get in the Bible? It ends, darkness is my closest friend. And yet I take a remarkable, enormous hope from that God gave me those words to say in my darkest moment. And somehow that is enough, even at that point, to be able to say, well, God, you gave me this word to say that actually at this moment, darkness is my closest friend, but you gave it to me, so you also are my friend. There's the paradox.
The book is called The Wilderness of Mirrors. It's published by Zondervan, Trusting Again in a Cynical World. The author is Meynell. We'll be right back.